Well, you are joining us for another themed content week here, and this week we are deep diving into the topic of leasehold. And joining me is leasehold expert Ian Mitchell, who's a partner at our friends and colleagues Anthony Gold here in London. And Ian, before we get going, leasehold is a very specialist niche area of law. This is something that you've really, specialised in and you're known for, and also a member of ALEP.
Yeah, we consider this an extremely specialist area where clients are best to instruct somebody with credentials. So somebody who's got 5-10 years experience in this area, who's ALEP accredited, who's familiar with all leasehold law, and in particular, one of our reasons for having this campaign this week is because of the changes that the government have been proposing in the sector. I myself was consulted by the Prime Minister's Special Advisor on Housing last year on how the government might, what direction they might go in terms of the changes that the Law Commission have been reviewing. So I think the public are aware that there are problems in the sector. Those problems need a solution, and I think what's happened over the past 2 years is there's been some consultation, and there's been a number of reports issued by the Law Commission, and now it's a question of what direction the government will go to implement these changes to enhance leaseholders' positions, because there's been a number of pitfalls identified with leasehold ownership, in particular onerous ground rents, the fact that the term of leases when they're originally granted will decline, and people will find over time that their assets aren't necessarily as saleable as they thought they were when they come to sell. And in addition to that, there's lease provisions which are complicated and onerous, which again leaseholders will find problematic when they're trying to rent, when they're trying to have pets in their properties, or they're trying to engage with their landlord to get information when they're selling. There's just lots and lots of problems. So let's talk about what's come out from the Law Commission. We had a report in September 2018 on leasehold home ownership, and on how leaseholders can buy their freehold or extend their leases. And the things that were looked at were simplifying the lease extension process and making it possibly cheaper for leaseholders to extend. And then this year, in January this year, we've had a further report from the Law Commission on how they might balance freeholders and leaseholders' rights in terms of the calculation that would apply for lease extension claims and for collective enfranchisement claims. So there's a lot to talk about following these consultation papers coming out, and there's a lot of uncertainty around what direction the government might go in.
So we'll be talking more about leasehold reform in a video later in the series, but Ian, just wanted to pick up with what you said about the government getting involved. Is that actually a positive thing?
Well, it depends on what side of the market or what side of the industry you're operating on. A big focus in the consultation that the Law Commission undertook was to look at the industry from leaseholders' perspectives, look at their needs and what they actually get from buying flats and what their expectations are, and also looking at freeholders' expectations in terms of why they have acquired these reversions and what they expect to get out of it. And I think as much as the report is aimed at trying to make the process for extending leases and buying freeholds simpler, there has been there needs to be a measured approach on where you draw the line, because as much as it would be really nice to make lease extensions cost-free, that would have a very significant effect on freeholders' portfolios, the asset value of their portfolios. In fact, it would even affect the value of some pension funds. So you could even have a situation where leaseholders have got pensions that have interest in ground rents, and then the legislation in one hand give by diminishing or decreasing the cost of their extension or the cost of buying their freehold, where on the other hand it affects their pension value because they've got their pension fund has been invested in some of these assets. So what are leaseholders looking to get out of buying a flat? Well, it's a capital investment. For most leaseholders, it will be a capital investment in a property which they intend to live in. So they're looking for shelter, security. They're not looking at the long-term prospect of having to pay the landlord more money to continue to live in the flat, and that's the shortcomings of the leasehold system. So you buy a lease, may have been granted for 125 years and 99 years from a particular commencement date. When that lease has got 85 or 75 years unexpired, the market perception is such that it needs topping up, and the freeholder needs to be paid a premium for that event. That's the other side of the coin. So you've got freeholders who buy these things to collect ground rent, and an industry where they can service flat owners and maintain buildings via management charges, service charges, repair bills, that kind of thing. Also ground rent income. So if you take away that, they're not be very happy. So it's got to be a fine balancing act, I think, and a measured approach to whatever legislation's put through on the books on this issue.
Yeah, indeed, it's quite interesting because from the investment perspective, we'll have big professional landlords watching this that do actually own freeholds, collect ground rents, but then we'll have a small landlord who's maybe got one or two buy-to-let properties, and when you're buying a leasehold property from an investment perspective, it's absolutely paramount that you do get a professional to read the lease and understand, because there may be restrictions in there, such as subletting fees, tenant not being allowed to have a pet, certainly when it comes to if you're thinking about doing something like Airbnb serviced accommodation. So the lease is an absolutely pivotal document, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, most people when they buy leasehold property probably get a full report on what they're buying. There's a report on title, but the problem is you have to remember the report that you receive from your solicitor that's on a 30-40 page document, the ins and outs of it. So you're going to come. So most people actually turn to their lease when there's a problem. Some of the examples you gave, I want a pet in my flat. There's a regulation in the schedule of my lease that prohibits me having a pet. Now I didn't know that perhaps you didn't know that until you had a pet and one of your neighbours complained to you. But I mean, the principle is if it's written in your lease and you contravene the terms of your lease, you're in breach of lease. Now, and the freeholder is usually under an obligation to take enforcement action against leaseholders who are in breach. The reason for that is for block management purposes. So there's an understanding that the landlord will ensure some kind of normality in a building. So if there's ground rules around hanging washing out on the balconies, not having pets, keeping the windows clean, the landlord's required to enforce those covenants and make sure that the building is up to that the appearance and the habitation standards of the building are maintained. Equally on the subletting front, people only find out that there's a problem when they've taken that step and they've rented their flat out. It could be in a short tenancy, or it could be an Airbnb let, and then the landlord contacts them. Maybe a neighbour's complained about the situation because of the frequency of people coming and going from the property, and they're informed that maybe the lease has a very strict covenant requiring that the actual owner and only the owner and his family occupy that flat, not his tenants or whatever the basis of the letting is. Now, if that is the case, then the lease rules the lease rules what you do, and again, the landlord's obliged to enforce those covenants, and may do that for his own agenda as well, because if you are in breach of the letting provisions in your lease, then the freeholder could use that as a method of extracting legal fees from you. You could commence a forfeiture process. May not get too far down that road, but it's still part of the industry on the landlord side, where they're always looking at ways to operate and make fees from people who are in breach of their leases. They've got people who are paid to write letters to people who are in default. They've got lawyers instructed to send out 146 notices. But I think the important thing, the important message for people who have flats where they think they're in breach of lease is to not admit that in open communication with the freeholders or the managing agents, but to seek advice, because there may be something that can be done to mitigate the situation. Maybe there can be some agreement reached on the side letter with the landlord if he doesn't want to vary the terms of the lease to permit the letting on terms, or maybe the landlord can be approached and there can be some negotiations had to vary the terms of the lease. Sometimes that agreement may actually may require payment of a premium. Again, it really depends on whether that's reasonable. If someone's looking to to vary their lease so they can do an Airbnb letting, they may well be happy to pay a nominal premium to the landlord to regularise that situation, so that moving forward there isn't that problem.
Well, let's be just clear here, Ian. We're not scaremongering when we say about forfeiture of lease. You deal all the time with these cases where a lease has been breached and the freeholder wants to take action. So we do want to stress throughout this week that you must adhere to the terms and condition of your lease, and that you deal with cases all the time where this has occurred, and you're helping the flat owner stop this process of the lease being forfeited.
Exactly. So, we have situations actually that arise in the context of the lease extension and the enfranchisement work that the department does, where as a surveyor would attend the property to undertake, so it's the landlord surveyor actually would be engaged at an early stage when a notice is served, and the surveyor would report back to the freeholder that they've found some breach at the flat. Maybe there's a tenant there and they've read the lease and reported back and said this guy shouldn't be renting out. Maybe these are actual examples. Maybe the garage and there's a shed or an outbuilding that's been demolished and is part of the demise, and it's been demolished without permission. Maybe there's alterations that have been made in the flat or additions. So we've had situations where the clients have installed, they've moved the bathroom from one location to another without permission. We've even had situations where somebody installed a central heating system in their flat, and the landlord alleged that they were in breach of lease because they had to put an outflow through the structural wall, and the lease prevented them from cutting or maiming the building structure. And that might seem like a minor breach because the leaseholder assumed that they would be able to do that because it's a pretty regular thing installing a central heating system in your flat. But if your lease has that kind of provision, you could be in difficulty. These things are always resolved, Vanessa. It's not a case that that there's always some solution that we can come up with. And each of the examples that I've referenced, there was a solution. And it usually entailed some variation of the lease or some agreement with the landlord that we negotiated, or an application to the first-tier tribunal where the issue was reviewed. The freeholder, if they allege a breach and it's an untenable position for the tenant because of the situation they find themselves in, it's not always the case that your hands are tied. So there is the first-tier tribunal that you can seek redress at to rebalance the table.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important point because, if you are an owner of a leasehold property, you do have to adhere to the terms and condition of the lease. It's not yours to do with as you want, and that's going to be a theme throughout this week of content. Anyway, that is it for today's instalment, but please join us tomorrow as our Leasehold Made Simple week continues.